Persona is a long-standing franchise that has captured the hearts of many, whether it be the fight through Tartarus in Persona 3, or going into the TV world in 4, or fighting evildoers in 5. Everyone usually speaks about the last 3 games in the series. Me, I was personally introduced with Persona 5. I've heard a friend of mine become infatuated with the Persona series and then recommended it to me. After playing it, I've been in love with the series ever since. However, this story I'm going to save until we get to that particular point. But the problem is, no matter how much I enjoy the previous entries that I've mentioned before, I've decided to go back in time and instead look at the games that not a lot of people talk about, which is the original Persona games, Persona 1 and Persona 2. For this video, I will be talking about Persona 1, or more accurately, Revelations Persona. It's a game I haven't really thought about playing since I was happily engulfed with the modern-day Persona games. However, in recent memory, I've been thinking about actually getting around to playing it, and I did. This video will be a long-standing review and a bit of a critique on the game. But before we begin, I want to tell you guys, this is my 5th time trying to play this game. I've tried to play this game 4 previous times before this, and I've always come to one single issue, which we'll get into a little bit later on in the video. I did fully complete this game, however, and this is going to be all of my thoughts and opinions going forward, but because I've officially beat the game, I can talk about all of my feelings in detail, and I can say more than just it's okay or it's bad. But with that said, let's jump into it. So when going through how to play it, I decided to go instead for the PSP remake, considering the localization for the original Persona was kind of a hot mess. From what I can gather, the game changed almost all of the characters. Some bizarre changes include Mark becoming black, changing Nanjo's hair color so that it's blonde, and the protagonist gets a whole facelift in the localization. It's all a bit bizarre, to be honest, so following this decision I decided to boot up the PSP version. And boy does it look hideous. Now, for clarity, I was playing the game on an emulator because that way I'd be able to actually record the footage necessary for the gameplay sections and whatnot. So when I say the game looks hideous, I'll be taking into account that it's possible that the emulator itself actually messed up the game. I did look at others playing the game and it does look the same, only my resolution is a little higher for, my monitor and stuff like that. But in any case, yeah, this game does not look good. Not even a little bit. All the characters look as though they were smeared with paint. It's a bit distracting. Not game-breaking, mind you, but just distracting. But moving onwards from that, the 3D models when you're in the game look really good environment-wise, and even the monsters and animations look as good as they can be for a remake of a game that came out in 1996. So it's not all bad or terrible, but even still, it can be a bit off-putting. I guess, for more accurate terms, it's as faithful of an adaptation or remake as any game could get, much like how the remake of Resident Evil was to its original counterpart. Comparing gameplay slides of both Persona 1 versions allow you to see the changes that were made or kept. In that regard, I don't see much else in the way. In regards to how the music and the other changes affect my enjoyment of Persona 1, it's pretty subjective. But since I did begin my journey with the later Persona games and am coming back to this game with that mindset, I of course have no issues with the changes in the soundtrack because I think it matches the other games. But I've heard a lot of people talking about the importance of the music and how it differs from the original vision that the original game had, and while I have no opinion on it, I can understand the fans of the OG's perspective and why they'd be pretty off-put by the new style of music that this remake has. Hearing a lot about the infamous PlayStation 1's version kind of makes me happy I just went with the PSP remake, but I confess that it might have been funnier if I were to just seen the localization issues for myself. I know one of the most infamous changes is Mark's race for sure. Thankfully, the best meme was saved in the PSP remake, and that of course is, Mark dances crazy. Which just never fails to not make me laugh. But with all of that out of the way, all that setup and explanation, I think we should talk about the story first, and then afterwards delve into the gameplay side of things, so I can finally explain to you what my issue, or compliments, of the game actually are. Persona takes place in 1996 and centers around the main character, the boy with the earring. We begin the game with a group of students inside of a classroom. 2 characters, known as Mark and Brown, have a bet to see if something works, and all of them get into a corner. They all play something called the Persona game, which is kind of like the Bloody Mary game here in the real world. At first, nothing happens, but then everybody is struck by electricity, where they are all met with Philemon, who tells them about personas. He explains that personas are just like masks in the real world. They're the manifestations of the person's psyche. Soon after, everybody wakes up and decides to go to the hospital to get checked out. While at the hospital, the party decide to meet their friend who's bedridden named Maki. Just after leaving, however, a major earthquake occurs and the main characters decide to wander the newly constructed hospital. They move down to the lobby where most of the protagonists awaken to their personas. When they get to the lobby, Nanjo finds his butler has been killed and he vows vengeance. Nanjo's butler made a small appearance earlier, but he's not important in the grand scheme of the game. This plot doesn't really come up again, which is kind of a shame, but in any case, the protagonist can help a woman who's trapped underneath a vending machine, which is presented as a player choice. You make your choice, and soon afterwards, the rest of the protagonists go to find Maki's mother, who is at Alaya Shrine. Maki's mother says that the person behind this entire thing is a man by the name of Kandori, and he's using something called the Deva system. With that in mind, the rest go back to the school, which is said to be the safest place in town. Once they arrive, they run into Maki, who is up and running now for some odd reason. The characters question this, but Maki is only confused by the others' confusion. After this, Nanjo asks the player to help Mark and Brown, two other kids in the party, because they got captured at the police station. So we go over there and break them out of prison. After this event, the rest of the party decide to go and confront Kandori. They go through the Sebek building and find Kandori at the top of the tower. His right-hand man corners him and sends him into the Deva machine. The main protagonist is given an option of whether or not to press a blue button or a red button. The red button is the button to stop the machine altogether, which will free Kandori, but save the older man. If you press the blue button, you can basically have the old man kill Kandori and be done with it. Regardless of whatever the protagonist chooses, you don't stop him and are teleported to the school gym, where it appears that you sent to the past about 6 months ago. Except it's not in the past, it's actually revealed to be a parallel universe, where the Maki that we were traveling with tells us that this is her world. When that occurs, a girl who's been causing mischievous actions appears, and you go and meet with her. Her name is Aki, and she's been causing issues towards the school for a while. She buggers off, and the party goes to try and meet with her. The party enters the second half of town through the use of the subways, where it appears that she belongs to. But before they can get to her, they have to go through a place called the Black Market. However, the harem queen won't let them leave this place without talking to her first. This causes a long workaround of the party having to go through the harem queen's palace before the party can leave. This does have significance towards the plot, though. Either way, the party gets all the way down to the basement, and the queen is sitting next to a mirror, which Maki recognizes the girl, and the girl uses a power of a mirror to send them away. When she uses the mirror causes moles to appear on the harem queen's face when she uses it. Anyways, you must backtrack and do the same exact dungeon again, but this time with added enemies and whatever else she has down there. Once making it down to the bottom of the dungeon again, she locks everybody into place and asks the protagonist if her paintings are good or bad. This is another player choice. But afterwards, you'll have to fight her with only you and Maki. It is here that the harem queen is revealed to be called Chisato, and she comes from the real world. Her and another man named Yosuke came into this world together, though it's not explained how they came into this world together. Or if it is explained, I haven't found out. Yosuke rushes in through the mirror in the room, and Chisato reveals she actually stole away Yosuke from Maki, knowing that Yosuke liked Maki more. But Yosuke accepts the ugly aspects of Chisato, saying he's not perfect either, and actually tells Chisato that he loves her more now, even though he did like Maki before. This reverses the curse set on Chisato, and she regains her beauty. All of her moles disappear. Regardless, this whole thing is a moment for Maki's character to accept Chisato as her friend. This also allows the party to pass towards the castle, knowing that the castle is indeed where Aki is. When the party gets into the castle, they realize that they can't enter unless they fill in a pedestal with another half of what looks to be a compact. They are told to go to the Lost Forest, so the party go to where another girl is at named Mai, who lives in said forest. Mai asks a long string of questions, which is pretty important to getting the good ending, but again, it's up to the player to choose their answers. These questions are mostly character motivations. She asks you why you continue to fight so hard, and depending on your answer, she will ease up to you. Anyways, after talking with her, the party get a piece of something called the Compact, which is important for later. They return to the castle where they continue through it and confront Aki. With this, the player and the others get a second compact. Aki disappears, and the party are told to go to the haunted house, which is by far the easiest dungeon in the game, thankfully. At the very end of the dungeon, there's a big enemy, which again gives the player a big choice of whether or not to attack it. Assuming the player lowers their weapons, it's revealed that the monster was Maki's real mother from the real world. She was pulled into this world as well. After that, you're forced through a portal and then are moved back to the real world. You teleport into Kandori's palace in the real world, which he uses to turn the city into a crater. This is the final dungeon of the bad ending. You go and meet Kandori at the top of the palace, where he wishes to fight the protagonist and his party since they oppose his ideology. Before you begin the fight, he'll ask the protagonist one last question, and then Nanjo, the rich kid, points out how pathetic Kandori's been living, and this basically sets the fight off. Once you beat his final form, his persona takes over, and you fight the persona. Once you defeat him, he admits that he basically lived an empty life, and that he now respects Nanjo. If you've gotten the bad ending, the game will end here, never knowing the rest of the story, because you weren't kind enough and your decisions didn't reflect that. However, if you were kind to Mai, then the game will continue onward. Kandori reveals that with the Deva system, the alternative world that we've been in was made from the memories and desires from the real Maki back at home. She built the world to fit what she deemed was perfect. Thus, why she's a bright, bubbly person, along with no police office, because that isn't necessary in a perfect utopia. Mai, the little kid in the forest, is a fragment of Maki's real personality, as well as the Maki we've been traveling with, who, as it turns out, is the ideal version of what Maki wants to truly be. Aki is another fragment of Maki as well, except this is the part of Maki who actually gives into Kandori's nihilism. Anyways, the Maki in our party runs away knowing this truth, and the rest of the party must run after her. Inside of the room that Maki runs into, we find the real Maki, who is hooked up to wires and cables, and this is where the ideal Maki understands everything. She runs away back into the dream world, and the rest of the party chase her. The party end up in the lost forest, where they encounter Mai. They tell her that they want to help Maki as best as they can. Mai tells the party that ideal Maki is hiding somewhere deeper in the forest, and so the party get right to going after her. Once the party find her, the protagonist has a choice on how to approach this topic, and assuming you choose to comfort her, she will rejoin the party and give you her compact, which at this point in the story gives you two. The last one is inside of a cavern in a cave behind the shrine of Alaya. The real Maki from the normal world is there, and that's where the final compact is. So, the party go back to the shrine, and it's revealed only two people can go through it, that being Maki and the protagonist. This happened once before, when we were facing against the harem queen. They both make it to the bottom of the cave, where Maki is found, the real one. They're in a place called the Sea of Souls, where the entire human collective consciousness resides. The ideal Maki talks to the real Maki and tells her that they should try and be better. At that, the real Maki gives you the compact. It's a real nice story moment for Maki, and seeing as the entire game revolves around her, it's a nice bit of character for her. It's a sequence that would eventually appear in a game in the future with Persona 4, which is accepting your true self. I digress though. After the death of Kandori, Aki went to go and awaken Pandora. However, Pandora ends up devouring Aki, which in turn ends up erasing Aki's half of the city. Mai holds onto the side of the city with the school, the first half of the town, and Aki holds onto the other aspects of the city. Interestingly enough, I've noticed Aki owns the part of the city where all of the more quote-unquote bad aspects of the town reside. This includes the police station, abandoned factory, and Kandori's corporation. I could be completely wrong, but I think it's a pretty cool detail. So Pandora is a creature at the core of the Deva system, and Pandora wishes to use the Deva system to wipe everything from existence. So, the party make their way to the library, which is where Pandora is being held. Once inside, the party fight their way rigorously towards the bottom, where Pandora is waiting for you. Pandora is an extremely nihilistic being whose views mirror Kandori's. Pandora sums up all the negativity and the jealousy the real Maki possesses due to being hospitalized, and since it is at the core of the Deva system, it can be used to return things back to normal. The party fight her, and once that's over, all the compacts get combined together and restores the world back to how it was. As everybody is leaving to go home, the ideal Maki stays behind, clamoring that this is her world. She kisses the protagonist on the cheek and tells him she loves him. The main protagonist is sent home after that, and Philemon congratulates the player for beating the game, basically. After that, Maki makes it out of the hospital and is almost like the ideal Maki. Nigel ends up around his peers, Mark is the same, and so is Brown, but regardless, the credits play, and it tells the player of the fates of the party. Interestingly enough, the main character is left up to the player, which I think is a pretty cool detail. So that about sums up the story in like the most not descriptive thing I can put it. That way I can sum it all up and get my emotions out. And I think the story is really lackluster. The main core issue that I have with the plot is the characters that reside within. Nanjo, Mark, and Maki make up the core team along with the protagonist. The final slot in your roster is determined by you. The main issue here is the game doesn't tell you who you can bring along with you. I thought everybody else would come into the party later, so being naive, I just brought Brown, who was the character that you just rescued out from prison, and I thought he was supposed to come with you. Brown adds next to nothing to the plot. His inclusion is more annoying because of his narcissism. Maki is the center point of the story. It hinges on being able to like her as a character, and I like Maki as a character because she feels natural, and obviously with the story revolving around her, it lets us develop her a lot more, and she gets to rummage through her mistakes and weaknesses. But if other players don't connect with her, the game falls short, and the story therefore becomes very one note. The plotline with Chisato and Yosuke happen, and while it is a nice plotline, it's rushed to all hell, and while it does add to the plot by allowing us to know where Aki is, I definitely think it could have been worked on a bit more, especially because it was mentioned a little earlier on, and this was the setup that we got. Regardless, it is in the game, and due to it being there, I'm giving it some criticism. The concept of the entire game happening because of Maki is actually a concept I happen to enjoy. The execution, on the other hand, left a lot for me to be desired for. The story feels like it's a giant fetch quest, and the handling of what's important is kind of strange. For example, I'm not entirely sure if the Deva system affected the real world drastically due to not being in the real world for long. And when the Deva system is finally destroyed, does the town just forget that demons existed and tried to kill them? I have more questions, but those are the biggest questions I have. If I were to give it some sort of score, I'd probably give it like a 6. I mentioned earlier, as I kept explaining the plot, that the player character gets some decisions for him to decide. The implications of these decisions is revealed when you encounter another one of yourself sitting down near Pandora. Your player character tells you what kind of person you are and reflects on the decisions you've chosen. If you've been nice to everybody during the game, he, by which I mean you, give yourself the items to get the ultimate persona of the game. I'm not entirely sure what he says if you've been a dick to everybody, but I don't want to replay the game to find out. This moment, however, I think is an extremely great moment for you as a character. The game is an RPG, a role-playing game, so your decisions mattered in some way to you as a person. You role-played all of that decision. It is what led you to being there, and I think it's pretty neat. Of course, some of those choices, specifically the choices with Mai and Kandori, are needed for the good ending, but notice that the choices given to you are more philosophical in nature, while the choices outside of that are about how you approach things individually as yourself. I think it's pretty brilliant, but that about sums it up for this entire section, which is the narrative. A lot of things were said, and it's not perfect, but some of the ideas thrown in here work for what it's trying to do, but a lot of them don't really land, unfortunately, and that's a shame because a lot of the aspects of the plot are really decent in concept, but they really didn't do a lot to capitalize on it, at least to me. There's a lot of stuff to cover in the gameplay section. I will be going into extreme detail to explain the way the game works so that when I talk about the shortcomings, you'll better understand why I feel that way. So gameplay is extremely different compared to something like the modern day Persona games. Unlike in the modern day series, this game does not take place over a single year. It doesn't have social sim elements at all. Instead, Persona 1 opted for a simplistic JRPG style. It strings you along from one place to another according to the story. In this regard, you can almost compare it to a modern-day Final Fantasy title. Modern in the sense that it takes place in the modern time period. The very foundation of what would eventually become the modern-day Persona games is still here, though. In Persona 1, The protagonists of the game can summon personas and use their abilities in combat. Personas, much like other JRPGs, employ different elements within their movesets. This ranges from healing spells with Dia and Media, to defense spells such as Sukukaha, to finally offensive magic spells such as Garu, Bufu, and Agi. Elements are just like the way they are in Pokemon. Every demon has an elemental resistance or strength to it. These types are critical to doing damage along with surviving. If you hit a demon in its weak point, you'll do more damage to it. Along with using your persona, you have access to a melee attack and a gun in combat. Every character in combat has a different proficiency. For example, the main character can use swords and machine guns. Maki uses a bow and arrow as well as a pistol. Nanjo uses a two-handed sword and a sniper rifle, etc. This gives everybody in combat their own unique role to fulfill. Combat is placed on a grid-based system, where the type of weapon you have determines where in the field you can attack. For example, Maki is a bow and arrow type character, and as such, placing her in the back allows her to hit the greatest number of enemies. The same can be said about placing Mark along the front, as it would be easier for him to reach closer enemies with the axe that he has. This system adds some depth to the combat, as it allows you to change everybody's positions in a way that makes combat feel more tailored to you. This system doesn't just extend to your melee weapons though. Everything in combat is focused on the grid. Attack spells, defensive spells, and using items as well. Using spells takes up the entire grid, so the only off trade that you have is using your SP or spirit points to use these spells. There's more to combat than just fighting, however. In this first game, you're able to speak to the demons that you encounter. The demons all come with 4 emotions. This is anger, happiness, eagerness, or scariness. When you've engaged the enemy, you're given the choice of attacking, contacting, auto-battling, formations, and escaping. The contact option is where the system with the emotions comes into play. When you're engaged in contact, you've got several options to speak to the demons. The first thing you'll have to decide what character should speak to the demon. All the characters have different options in speaking to the demons. For example, the main character has the option of persuading, inviting, singing, or taunting, while Nanjo has the options of bribing, condescending, pontificating them, or being sarcastic. Depending on the emotions and the nature of the demons, their responses will change. Your ultimate goal is wanting the demons to become really eager, because this in turn will allow you to gain their spell cards. If you don't want their spell cards, you can gain something else, which can sometimes net you extra experience points or choosing money. Once you finish gaining something from them, more often than not, the encounter will end. So what else happens when you get the other options? Well, if you can't get eager, the next best thing is happiness, where sometimes the demons will become happier, where it may get hit with the status ailment of happiness. This usually has the benefit of causing the demon to not attack that turn, which is beneficial to you. Next is becoming afraid of you. This inflicts the demon with the scared ailment, and has a chance to run away from the battle. And that's about it. Pretty nice and easy. The one you want to avoid is anger, because it just enrages the enemy and you don't get anything out of it, except of course them being aggressive during battle. Sometimes this will cause the demon to attack first, which may be critical to surviving the entire encounter. There's usually a lot to consider when it comes to these exchanges, usually because the responses you give to the demon are dependent on their natures. Natures are just like their personality type, and not only do the responses change per demon, but they also change depending on sex as well. I'll be the first one to say, I did not do this blindly. I looked up a guide because knowing which demon has what personality along with the responses is a bit of a hassle. It's a bit of a small issue, especially if you're using a guide, but if you aren't using a guide, then it can become a bit complicated and a lot of guesswork can be involved. Next up, we've got to talk about the way the experience works. Not all the characters get the same amount of experience points equally when the fight is done. According to what I've seen and some secondhand reports, the way I understand it, experience is rewarded based on the actions the characters performed during battle. So, if the character was guarding or not doing much of anything during that round, then that character won't get as much as everybody else. In my playthrough, Maki was a powerhouse that I found the most useful. She had a bow and arrow that can pierce the enemies towards the back. This, coupled with the fact that she can heal, makes her the perfect candidate to get a bunch of experience. Meanwhile, someone as useless for me, such as Mark, barely got anything due to what he was using and where he was on the battlefield. The two single most useless characters I had in my party were Brown and Mark, who had specific placements needed for them to work. This did change as the end of the game approached, however, as I gave Mark a persona with the ability Megiddo, which absolutely decimated the enemies, and thus he gained extreme amounts of experience, and thus actually became my ace in the hole. I will say that I am not a huge fan of this system whatsoever. On one hand, it's kind of like real life. If I sat on my ass doing nothing, I'm sure I wouldn't get really any better, but in this context, this being a game, it's a bit wacky that not all of the party members would be getting the same treatment. The issue becomes finding a use for the party members that may not be good for a dungeon. A good example is in my own playthrough. During the castle, Mark was next to useless due to the placement of the enemies and also what I had on his persona at the time. If one of them were in the back row, he'd be pretty assed out. This level discrepancy carries over to creating personas as well. Whenever you get the skill cards of the demons you obtain, you may bring these cards over to the Velvet Room, which allows the player to fuse two cards together to get a single persona that may be used. The individual system is not a bad thing. In fact, it's pretty self-explanatory. Igor, the man running the Velvet Room, has two options for mixing personas. You may either do it yourself with some trial and error, or you can do a guided fusion, which allows Igor to help you get the best results. Each persona has an arcana, and each player character does as well. After fusing a persona, you can then go on and give it to any party member. The game tells the player whether or not the persona is compatible with the party member. Usually you'll want to pair up the bests with each other so you can get the full potential out of that persona. But there's other affinities such as good and worst. While it's not super important to be matching all the characters up to their bests, usually sticking to good and best will make everything work out. My major issue with fusions and personas in this game is the level requirement for the personas. It could just be my luck, but when attempting to fuse any persona, they're usually pretty high level, somewhere up in the 40s and 50s, thus rendering those cards I have useless until I go and get another spell card that helps me get a persona closer to my level. My issue is probably only personal, but I only made around 10 personas, maybe even less so. It feels as though the level for making personas is too high. This, of course, circles back to the other issue of players being useful and also gaining different sets of experience, as you'll need the average level of your party members to be equal to the persona you want to get, and I find this a bit frustrating. Of course, that last section could also just be me playing the game incorrectly or just being terrible at it in general, but it made the enjoyment worse for me as having personas is paramount to getting through the game. I did mention earlier that using the party member increases the experience that is gained from the fight. This applies to persona experience as well. Personas come with a separate persona column after finishing battles, which tell the player how close they are to leveling up as well. But there's another mechanic personas have. You see, persona experience and level are irrelevant. That's just there so that the player knows that the personas are gaining levels with them. Every level up a persona gets you nothing but stat improvements, which is fine. That makes sense. But there's another system at play regarding the use of personas. Personas also have ranks. When the player first awakens a persona at the beginning of the game, the player characters use them immediately and immediately gain a rank. Ranks are what are used by the game to determine when the persona gets their next ability. I believe a persona's rank only goes up to be 8. Using your persona gets them a bit closer to reaching the next rank, but there is no experience bar or indicator that you are close to ranking up, at least not when I was playing, but the ranking definitely does exist. The higher up in player level you are, and the lower level your persona's rank is, will determine how much quicker you'll get that rank up. So if you're like level 30 and having a persona you're just now using that's rank is 1, chances are you'll immediately rank up to rank 2 in one use of the persona. Then it'll be 2 ranks to rank up to 3, and so on and so forth. Although that's not fixed, and it is determined by your player level. So where does this leave combat as a whole? Well, combat is ultimately fine, except the issue isn't the combat itself, it's actually the encounter rate. You see, Persona has a bad habit of forcing encounters down your throat like you've got the flu. If you've finished a battle on the overworld, it could be 1 microsecond later where you'll get an encounter, and it does happen more than you think. Escaping battles is also a hassle. Every time you want to run away, the game takes this obnoxious approach of taking around 3 to 5 seconds of doing ellipses and then telling you that you can't run away before then having to go through the long, arduous task of watching the enemies go through their animations, which I haven't touched on, but I will in a minute. This can leave a player frustrated as they likely want to get to save or shop for an item in the overworld or simply want to think for themselves. Counter to this is buying an expensive item early game that's called the Purifying Salts, which allows you to repel lower level enemies. I don't think it's ever worked for me. I was just caught up with the enemies in the game, but that's because of the obnoxious number of encounters. And I just want to say, I'm really happy I emulated this game because that turbo button really does save a lot more time than I'm willing to admit. Now that I've mentioned time, I want to touch on the animations. I would have lumped this over with the graphics section, but the biggest problem is that it affects gameplay. The main problem with it is that the slow wind-up times and the general speed of the game. Thankfully, the game allows you to skip the animations, but if the game gives you that option, does that really mean it's a good thing? It feels like it's a bit self-aware. But for what it's worth, the animations themselves are fine for this type of game, but I definitely feel I would have spent an eternity on the game were it not for the turbo button with escaping encounters and skip button for the battle animations. I went into a large amount of detail explaining the combat, but I'm not exactly finished with the rest of the gameplay either. Besides combat, there are 3 types of exploration to be had within the game. Let's start with dungeons because it's the most interesting aside from combat. You see, in dungeons, you'll be traveling them in a 3-dimensional space. You'll be in first person, and then you can move forward, backwards, left, and right. It's kind of a Doom view, where I feel like you'll end up picking up a gun and shooting demons with it. But it's fine, the modeling for the dungeons feels nice, and it feels refreshing. Every location you're in at least has a standout theme that it's going for. The Lost Forest is vivid with its purple and darker colors, which is totally different from a place like Sebek, which is more office and business-like, which is even more classy when compared to the Harem Queen's hideout, which is more grungy and underground. Each dungeon has a good palette of visual diversity that is very neat. Most of the game, you'll be seeing the dungeon screen. If you aren't in combat, you'll be traversing dungeons like this. Along with the first-person camera perspective, you'll get a small mini-map at the bottom corner, which is pretty handy when backtracking and even getting an understanding of where you're going. Some dungeons have gimmicks in them. The worst one, at least in my playthrough, was the Kama Palace, which is the Harem Queen's hideout, and getting to her is a total nightmare. The gimmick of this dungeon is that you can fall through the floor and get deeper inside of it. You need to get to the bottom, which is on B9, level B9. Not all of the holes you'll fall into lead to where you should be going, so you'll more than likely end up lost and confused. And if you don't have the emergency exit or the Bestow spell, you'll be doing a lot of backtracking, which can make your playthrough ridiculous. This adds to also the previous issue about escaping from battle, and also the amount of battles you'll likely get into before you get back to where you want to be. Thankfully, however, the other gimmicks are never as bad. Sometimes you'll get a tile change where your character will pivot 90 degrees to the left or right, such as in the Lost Forest, or you'll get arrows that force you down a path like in the subways. Along with the normal paths inside of dungeons, there's other rooms within the dungeon that the player can go inside of. This includes the save room, the item shop, a spring to heal your character fully, and the Velvet Room, which of course are very good for the player. Among other rooms lie treasure rooms, which the player can then go in and get treasure for. All of this is fine and serves their purpose of making dungeons feel a bit easier for the player to get through, rather than an endless gauntlet of enemies and encounters, which softens the blow if a player is mass grinding in that specific section of the game. And that's it for dungeons. The other gameplay styles are a bit different. There is an adventuring mode where you'll see the player character and you can move him along the world. This is what a traditional JRPG looks like, with sprites everywhere and people to talk to as well. This is how most of the story is told, through the adventuring gameplay, where the character physically is seen and can move along this board. It's your standard affair of gameplay. I've never had any issue with this sort of gameplay, as usually whenever you're in adventuring mode, you'll be in safe rooms, so you can move in any way you like. Usually there'll be shops, story rooms, and treasure rooms while in adventure mode. The only issue I have is that the controls are a bit strange. In my case, left on the D-pad was to go down and right was to go up. It was a bit bizarre to get used to, but not a very large criticism. The last bit of gameplay is the overworld. You'll become a small cursor moving throughout the city of Mikage-cho. You'll move along the city streets and go to the precise location you'll want to go. This section also has random encounters inside of it, and you'll bet your ass there are a ton of encounters here as well. The only upside to these encounters, though, is the enemies being usually weaker than you, which helps getting through them easier as well. The city is pretty detailed in that you can physically see the places you're meant to go, which is pretty handy since everything can blend together sometimes. The city itself isn't very spontaneous or anything, but as a hub, it does its job well. There are 2 map hubs of the same city. In the story, you'll go to 2 different versions of the same city. The more destroyed city, which is where you'll most likely be for the majority of the game, and the normal city, which is where you start the adventure off. The good thing about the game is having the player explore the main city first, before being dropped off into into the city that becomes destroyed, giving the player some familiarity with the layout of the city before being dropped into the destroyed version. This concludes the main gameplay that appears throughout the game. There's a lot of fundamental issues I have with it. The main issue is the difficulty curve that happens towards the end of the game, which is just punishing. One dungeon has only the main character and Maki going through it, and it's pretty brutal because of it. It took me a little while to get through it, but eventually I did. That dungeon is indeed the second to last dungeon of the game, so of course I understand it being as difficult as it was. The last boss is extremely brutal. My characters were in the 40s when I faced the final boss, and it decimated me without delay, so I spent hours grinding to get a decent shot, and even then it was still a bit of a struggle. The main issue I have with the core gameplay is the difficult and insane number of encounters. I've mentioned this earlier. Along with getting the required experience for everybody, grinding can become a pain in the ass, and it doesn't help that it eventually will become extremely boring. As much as A Lone Prayer, the battle music for the game is good, I don't think I want to hear it for a long time after this. The bosses themselves aren't actually all that difficult, or at least I didn't have a major issue with them, save for the very final boss, which is definitely understandable for most people. That boss is insane. I've explained many of the different gameplay mechanics, and no doubt you'll be seeing a lot of these encounters in the background as I continue to speak. I won't tell you whether or not you'll enjoy it, but I can certainly say it is not my cup of tea. It wore out its welcome for me around level 20, and believe me, you'll be wanting to be around level 60 when the game is over. I recommend you give it a shot for at least a couple of hours, and then decide your own opinion towards it. I can't really do the game justice by simply speaking about it in this way. I can only really talk about my experience and my own thoughts while playing the game, and with that said, I definitely don't think I'll be returning for the gameplay portion of it. And that's Persona 1, a game I never thought I'd actually get through. For me, I can see where a majority of the future installments would build upon it, but this very core one is lacking something that I'm not entirely sure what it is. The combat is brutal oftentimes, and the grinding is quite repetitive, which then leads the game to become a slog to get through without cheating. The story doesn't really have any standout moments for me to fully recommend either, but what this game does have is the foundations to be built upon and get something going. Persona 1 got a sequel called Persona 2 Innocent Sin, which would further continue to develop what this game set up. But as for me, I can happily say I finally completed it. This game has a lot going for it, with some good concept and ideas that would eventually get fleshed out in later games. The contact system is one of those things that gets a bit streamlined in another game I'll talk about in the future. The fusion system becomes better as well, and really a bunch of the aspects here that are rough get smoothed out in future installments. But because this is the very first game, it is nice to see where the series got its footing, and how 1 will inspire 2, which will then inspire 3, and so on. Regardless, that's it from me. I hope you guys enjoyed my thoughts on Persona 1. No doubt going to get some disagreements, but that's what discussion is for. Feel free to comment to say what you've disagreed with or agreed with. I'm still new to this style of video making, well, video making in general, but I'll be sure to improve as these Persona videos come out. And this is actually going to be the first part of a possible 7-part series. My plan is to cover the next 2 Persona games, Innocent Sin and Eternal Punishment, each with their own videos, as well as covering 3 and Portable together in another video, and then I'll be covering 4 Golden, Q, Q2, and 5 to end things off, and maybe Scramble. So that'll be it for me. Until next time.